Harlem, New York, 9:18 p.m. Friday, August 11th, 1935. Rain slides down the brownstone bricks like grease, catching the sickly yellow glow of streetlights over 137th Street. The air inside Connie's Inn reeks of sweat, bathtub gin, and fear. The kind of fear that makes jazz musicians play off key and makes grown men check the exits twice, because everyone in the room has seen the man at the corner table. Arthur Dutch Schultz sits hunched over a whiskey, his cheap brown suit wrinkled from 3 days of wear. Sweat stains darken his armpits despite the October chill seeping through cracked windows. 2 thick-necked enforcers flank him, their guns printing visible bulges under wool coats that smell like mothballs and violence. Dutch's bloodshot eyes scan the room with the paranoid intensity of a man who kills for sport and knows others are keeping score. At a round table near the back wall, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson watches in absolute stillness. His charcoal suit is tailored to perfection, tie knotted with surgical precision, shoes polished like obsidian mirrors. The carved ivory handle of his walking cane rests under his right palm. No drink, no food, just calculated observation. Dutch Schultz has been bleeding money for months. The end of Prohibition gutted his beer empire. The Bronx policy rackets are drying up under federal pressure. But Harlem's numbers game still generates millions in untaxed cash, and Dutch has decided that respectful negotiation is for weaker men. 9:23 p.m. A waitress approaches Dutch's table. She's young, maybe 23, with tired eyes and careful movements that speak to months of walking on eggshells around dangerous men. She sets down his fresh whiskey and calls him sir in a voice barely above a whisper. Dutch grabs her wrist, hard. "What you call me?" He slurs, loud enough to cut through the music. "Sir?" He yanks her closer, his breath a toxic mixture of alcohol and decay. "You people don't call me sir. You call me Mr. Schultz. Say it." The room tightens like a fist. Conversations die mid-sentence. Even the trumpet player misses his next note. She tries to pull away. Dutch doesn't let go. "Say I'm sorry, Mr. Schultz," he hisses. "Say it like you mean it." His men grin. They've watched this performance before. The waitress stammers an apology. Dutch doesn't like her tone. With theatrical deliberation, he slaps the glass from her hand. It explodes against the floor, gin splashing her dress, a shard opening a red line across her palm. "Stupid jungle bunny," he spits, the slur landing like a physical blow. "You monkeys need to remember who owns this city." 9:26 p.m. Bumpy Johnson rises from his chair. No scraping, no announcement. He simply materializes from the shadows and begins walking toward Dutch's table, his cane tapping once against the wooden floor. Every eye in Connie's Inn shifts from Dutch to Bumpy, as if pulled by magnetic force. The music doesn't stop, but it might as well have. Bumpy stops 3 feet from Schultz. They're nearly the same height, but Dutch looks diminished. "You just made a mistake, Mr. Schultz," Bumpy says. His voice carries the quiet authority of a judge reading a death sentence. Dutch smirks, mistaking the calm tone for weakness. "Who the hell are you supposed to be?" Bumpy doesn't answer immediately. He looks at the bleeding waitress, then back at Dutch. His eyes hold no anger, something far more dangerous, mathematical precision. "This is Harlem," Bumpy says, each word measured and final. "You don't put your hands on our women. You don't call us monkeys. You don't spill blood on our floors without paying the price." Dutch laughs, the sound like breaking glass. "You gonna send me a bill, boy?" The word boy hangs in the air like poison gas. Several patrons flinch. Someone whispers a prayer. Bumpy tilts his head slightly. No visible reaction. No raised voice. No threats. Just one quiet sentence delivered with surgical detachment. "You have 72 hours to make this right." No explanation of what right means. No details about consequences. Just an ultimatum delivered with the certainty of mathematics. Then Bumpy Johnson turns his back on Dutch Schultz and walks toward the door. The ultimate disrespect. As he steps into the humid Harlem night, adjusting his hat against the drizzle, Bumpy is already calculating. Roots, loyalties, pressure points. Because behind that stillness lies a truth nobody in Connie's Inn understands yet. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson is afraid of Dutch Schultz. Not the fear that makes men run, the fear that makes men plan. 72 hours later, Dutch Schultz will be slumped in a Newark chop house bathroom, bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds, mumbling incoherent last words as his empire dissolves. In his jacket pocket, investigators will find a folded piece of paper with 5 words written in steady handwriting. Harlem remembers. Harlem collects. Always. The story of how Dutch Schultz lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now, let's go back to August 11th, 1935. Arthur Flegenheimer earned the name Dutch Schultz in Bronx street gangs where paranoia was survival and violence was currency. By 1935, he had evolved into something far more dangerous than a common thug, a millionaire psychopath watching his empire crumble beneath federal pressure. The repeal of Prohibition had severed his primary financial artery. Beer trucks that once generated $2 million annually now rusted in Bronx warehouses, while tax investigators froze his accounts over $90,000 in unpaid obligations. Dutch Schultz was drowning, and drowning men grab at anything within reach. What made Dutch uniquely terrifying was not his wealth or connections, but his complete abandonment of rational calculation. Where other mobsters killed for strategic reasons, Dutch killed because someone coughed during meetings. His paranoia had metastasized into terminal madness. He accused his own brother of theft. He beat lieutenants unconscious for ordering wrong sandwiches. Even Charles Luciano admitted that Dutch made him nervous, and Luciano had orchestrated executions in broad daylight without blinking. Dutch dressed like the desperation he carried. Suits that might have been expensive once now hung loose and wrinkled. Sweat stained under the arms from constant anxiety. His tie stayed crooked, collar frayed. Fingernails yellowed from cheap cigars he bit more than smoked. He looked like a man who slept in his clothes and woke up already angry. Beside him, whenever their worlds intersected, Ellsworth Johnson appeared carved from different material entirely. Bumpy's suits were tailored to surgical precision, shoes polished like obsidian mirrors, his ivory-handled cane a statement of absolute control. Where Dutch sweated through paranoid rages, Bumpy remained calculating and cool. The contrast was not merely aesthetic, it was philosophical. Bumpy understood violence as a tool requiring precision. Dutch wielded it like a drunk swinging a sledgehammer. Harlem's numbers game represented salvation to Dutch's bleeding finances. He moved into black territory, the way disease invades weakened tissue, crude, fast, indifferent to existing life. The first incident came in March, when Samuel Jenkins refused protection payments. Dutch sent 3 enforcers who shattered both of Jenkins' hands with ball-peen hammers, then burned his ledgers while his family watched in horror. In June, Dutch personally beat numbers runner Thomas Crawford unconscious on 125th Street, using fists, boots, and a tire iron for 7 uninterrupted minutes. Crawford's crime was collecting from a building Dutch claimed as territory. 40 witnesses watched. When police arrived, every witness suddenly remembered nothing. July brought the most disturbing escalation. Dutch walked into Madame Francine's policy parlor and urinated on betting slips while customers sat frozen in horrified silence. He announced the establishment now belonged to him. 2 men objected. Their weighted bodies surfaced in the Harlem River 3 days later. Bumpy recognized this pattern as something beyond territorial expansion. This was systematic racial humiliation delivered with theatrical cruelty designed to break spirits alongside bodies. Every act carried the subtext of white supremacy, each beating accompanied by slurs that cut deeper than physical wounds. What Bumpy felt toward Dutch was smart fear, the kind that makes intelligent men measure every move twice. Dutch represented chaos incarnate, a man so fundamentally unstable that standard rules of engagement became meaningless. Direct confrontation would trigger something Harlem could not contain. Dutch had money, guns, and political connections, who valued his contributions more than black lives. Then intelligence arrived that changed everything. Dutch was asking specific questions about Stephanie St. Clair, the queen of numbers herself. The incident at Connie's Inn suddenly acquired terrifying new context. Dutch had not randomly chosen that location or that waitress. He was declaring war on Harlem's most powerful woman, and wars against queens require the execution of kings. Within 20 minutes of Bumpy Johnson walking out of Connie's Inn, Harlem's underground communication network ignited like struck gunpowder. Bartenders called policy operators called numbers runners called street captains. The invisible telephone lines that sustained Black Harlem's economic survival transmitted information faster than Western Union could dream. By midnight, every significant player from 110th Street to 155th Street knew that Bumpy Johnson had given Dutch Schultz 72 hours to make things right. Nobody knew what right meant. Everyone understood what wrong would cost. Dutch Schultz heard the same story in his Bronx headquarters at 2 a.m, delivered by a jittery lieutenant who had learned to laugh at his boss's jokes regardless of humor content. Dutch's reaction was theatrical contempt performed for an audience of nervous enforcers. He slammed his whiskey glass against a table hard enough to crack the base, then launched into exaggerated mockery of what he imagined was Bumpy's voice, adding minstrel show affectations that made his men uncomfortable even as they forced laughter. The fancy Negro with the cane thinks he can threaten Dutch Schultz. The uppity monkey in his tailored suit believes he runs something besides numbers for washerwomen and porters. Dutch announced he would stretch 72 hours into 72 years just to prove that ultimatums from Harlem carried the weight of smoke. Bumpy's response began 6 hours and 43 minutes after leaving Connie's Inn. While Dutch performed for his crew, Bumpy sat in a basement office reviewing ledgers that detailed every policy bank Dutch still operated in the Bronx. His intelligence network had been mapping Dutch's crumbling empire for months, identifying vulnerabilities with surgical precision. The first hit came at dawn when 3 of Bumpy's most trusted men walked into Dutch's policy operation on Webster Avenue. No guns, no threats. They simply collected betting slips from customers who had been pre-contacted and convinced to move their business elsewhere. Within 40 minutes, the bank lost 80% of its morning revenue. Dutch's paranoia, always simmering beneath his surface like infected blood, erupted into full psychosis. He began seeing conspiracy in every delayed report and hesitation in every lieutenant's voice. When his Fordham Road captain arrived 15 minutes late to a meeting, Dutch beat him unconscious with a brass ashtray, convinced the delay indicated betrayal. His own men started avoiding eye contact, speaking in careful monotones, moving with the exaggerated caution of people navigating minefields. 48 hours remaining. An unmarked envelope arrived at Dutch's headquarters, delivered by a street kid who vanished before anyone could grab him. Inside, a single piece of paper with typed words, 48 hours remaining. No signature, no explanation. Dutch's hand shook as he read it. His crew watched their boss's confidence crack like ice under weight. The precision of the taunt unnerved him more than any threat could have. That same evening, Bumpy Johnson sat in the back booth of a Little Italy restaurant across from an Italian intermediary whose name never appeared in police files. The conversation lasted 17 minutes. Bumpy presented a proposal that had nothing to do with Harlem and everything to do with federal heat, unpaid taxes, and a madman planning to assassinate a prosecutor. The Italian listened without interrupting, nodded twice, and left without ordering food. Smart men recognized smart fear when they saw it. Dutch retaliated with the crude brutality that defined his entire approach to problems. He sent 4 men to grab Marcus Webb, one of Bumpy's most reliable runners. What they did to him took 40 minutes and required 3 men to hold him, while the 4th worked with methodical cruelty. They carved racial slurs into his chest and back, words that would scar permanently. They broke his fingers individually. Bumpy arrived at Harlem Hospital 30 minutes after Marcus was admitted. He stood beside the bed studying wounds that transformed human flesh into a canvas of hatred. His expression remained absolutely neutral, showing neither rage nor grief nor fear. He adjusted his tie with mechanical precision and spoke 5 words that carried the weight of iron sentences. Now it's not business anymore. Ellsworth Johnson understood that eliminating Dutch Schultz required elevation from street conflict to boardroom calculation. Harlem alone could not absorb the retaliation that would follow a direct hit on a white gangster with powerful connections. Smart warfare meant convincing those connections that Dutch had become more expensive than profitable. That required the attention of Charles Lucky Luciano and the commission that now governed organized crime like a corporate board of directors. The meeting took place in a Little Italy social club where sunlight never penetrated the back rooms and conversations disappeared into cigarette smoke. Bumpy arrived alone at the scarred wooden table, carrying nothing but his ivory-handled cane and information that could reshape the syndicate's power structure. Lucky Luciano sat flanked by Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, 3 men who had murdered their way into building what they called the modern underworld. They had summoned Bumpy not from respect, but because smart criminals recognize leverage worth hearing. Bumpy's proposal was elegant in its deadly simplicity. He presented Dutch Schultz not as a territorial rival, but as an existential threat to everything the commission had constructed. While Luciano's organization was systematically professionalizing organized crime, transforming street gangs into corporate structures that operated with business efficiency, Dutch remained a rabid animal, incapable of evolution. His refusal to adapt was not merely inconvenient, it was structurally unsound for everyone who depended on the new order's stability. The federal heat surrounding Dutch had reached temperatures that threatened to incinerate anyone standing nearby. Treasury agents had been building tax evasion cases for 18 months, documenting every unreported dollar while Dutch's empire generated millions. Where other mobsters had learned to pay taxes on legitimate front businesses, Dutch openly mocked legal obligations, bragging about owing the government money and treating subpoenas like toilet paper. Then came the Dewey problem. Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey had made Dutch his primary target, and Dutch's response revealed the depth of his madness. He was actively planning Dewey's assassination, discussing it openly, treating the murder of a high-profile prosecutor as casually as ordering lunch. Bumpy offered precise intelligence in exchange for Italian neutrality. Detailed information about Dutch's movements, safe houses in Newark, dwindling security arrangements, and vulnerabilities, not assistance, not weapons, just the absence of interference when Harlem moved against Dutch. He was requesting permission to eliminate a problem that threatened everyone equally. The commission's calculation was cold arithmetic. Dutch generated revenue, but chaos in equal measure. His unpredictability had already cost opportunities. His racial terrorism drew unwanted attention to operations in black neighborhoods. His plan to murder Dewey would trigger federal responses that could destroy decades of careful construction. Arthur Flegenheimer had become more trouble than his remaining earnings justified. 24 hours remaining. The envelope arrived at Dutch's Newark hideout, while federal agents simultaneously raided his last significant policy bank in the Bronx, seizing ledgers and arresting runners with choreographed precision that suggested someone had provided exact timing and locations. Dutch's paranoia exploded into complete mania as he realized the enemy wasn't just Harlem, but everyone. For Bumpy, this strategy required moral reckoning that tasted like ash. To protect his community from Dutch's violence, he had provided intelligence that would facilitate a man's execution. He was effectively becoming an informant for the Italian syndicate, crossing lines that usually meant death. but he weighed that cost against Marcus Webb's carved flesh and Stephanie St. Clair's safety. The commission voted in a windowless room where decisions became death warrants. They would not kill Dutch Schultz for Bumpy Johnson, but they would withdraw all protection, sever connections, and look away when inevitable violence arrived. Dutch Schultz was now completely isolated, and Bumpy Johnson had one final card to play. Dutch Schultz retreated to Newark like a wounded animal seeking familiar shadows, his Harlem expansion collapsing under coordinated resistance that felt orchestrated beyond mere opposition. Federal subpoenas multiplied like cancer cells around his Bronx operations, while policy players who once folded at the first sign of white muscle were suddenly unavailable, uncooperative, or quietly aligned with Bumpy Johnson. The Palace Chop House at 12 East Park Street became his makeshift headquarters, a place where Dutch could drink whiskey and pretend he still commanded an empire worth federal attention. Bumpy's final intelligence package arrived at the commission through the same Italian intermediary who had facilitated their original conversation, delivered with the precision of a master tactician placing a queen on the chessboard. The envelope contained handwritten notes detailing Dutch's exact location, the restaurant's floor layout, security arrangements that had degraded to 2 bodyguards, and the precise timing of his nightly routine. The information was so comprehensive it included which booth Dutch preferred, which bathroom stall he used, and the rotation schedule of his remaining muscle. Bumpy had transformed surveillance into an execution manual that left nothing to chance or luck. Psychological warfare continued with surgical precision designed to fracture Dutch's already damaged mental state. Anonymous phone calls delivered only the sound of ticking clocks before disconnecting. Florists delivered funeral wreaths to the Palace Chop House addressed to Arthur Flegenheimer, with cards reading soon. Newspaper clippings about his tax troubles appeared in his coat pockets, with certain paragraphs circled in red ink. Each reminder transformed paranoia into certainty that death was stalking him with patient inevitability. October 23, 1935 began for Dutch Schultz at 9 in the morning, when he woke screaming from dreams he could not remember. By 10, he was meeting with his shrinking inner circle, ranting about Thomas Dewey and insisting that killing the prosecutor would solve everything. At noon, he reviewed a crude assassination plan involving machine guns and wishful thinking, ignoring warnings that murdering a high-profile legal figure would trigger national outrage. By 2 in the afternoon, he was drinking whiskey at the Palace Chop House, the alcohol doing nothing to calm shaking hands. At 4:15, he ordered dinner he barely touched while detailing Dewey's daily schedule to bodyguards who were already calculating their own survival strategies. Between 6 and 9, he alternated between reviewing financial ledgers that showed nothing but red ink and screaming at waitstaff over imagined slights. While Dutch sketched madness over dinner plates, Bumpy Johnson sat in Marcus Garvey Park, engaged in his own form of calculation. A chessboard separated him from rotating opponents who knew nothing about underworld politics, but everything about patience. Bumpy's presence there was no accident. The park was public, populated, and filled with potential witnesses who would later remember seeing him calmly debating rook placements while Dutch Schultz bled out across the river. The truth about Bumpy's fear emerged in that contrast. He had never been afraid of Dutch's violence in the physical sense. Men like Bumpy accepted violence as weather. What terrified him was the chaos Dutch represented, the entropy that destroyed order and invited destruction upon entire communities without reason. Eliminating Dutch meant eliminating randomness, restoring equilibrium to a universe that required rules to function. At 10:15 in the evening, 2 men entered the Palace Chop House, wearing dark coats and darker intentions. Dutch Schultz sat reviewing his Dewey assassination plans, completely unaware that his 72 hours had expired 3 weeks ago. 2 gunmen entered the Palace Chop House with the mechanical precision of men completing a business transaction. They moved through cigarette smoke and dinner conversations, carrying revolvers loaded with ammunition designed to expand on impact and maximize internal damage. The first shot struck Dutch Schultz in the abdomen and chest as he sat reviewing assassination plans for prosecutor Thomas Dewey. The irony lost on a man whose consciousness was already fragmenting under hollow point bullets. His bodyguards returned fire while collapsing under their own wounds, creating crossfire that shattered bottles and punched holes through walls. The massacre consumed less than 90 seconds from first shot to the killer's disappearance through the back exit. Dutch survived the initial assault, but entered a twilight state between life and death that lasted 22 hours in Newark City Hospital. Police stenographers recorded his final words, transcribing delirium that revealed a mind dissolving under trauma and morphine. He rambled about mothers and money, threatened invisible enemies, delivered non sequiturs that read like poetry, stripped of meaning. A boy has never wept nor dashed 1,000 Kim, mixed with oh mama 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 and paranoid accusations about French-Canadian bean soup. The transcripts fascinated psychiatrists as documentation of consciousness fragmenting into linguistic chaos, but offered investigators nothing useful about who ordered his execution. When detectives inventoried Dutch's blood-soaked clothing, they discovered folded paper in his jacket's inner pocket, placed with deliberate care where it would survive the violence. 7 words written in steady handwriting carried the weight of epitaph. Harlem remembers. Harlem collects. Always. Nobody could explain when Dutch received it, but its message was unambiguous to anyone who understood the previous month's events. News of Dutch's shooting reached Harlem through the same underground network that had spread word of the Connie's Inn confrontation, telephone lines carrying information faster than morning newspapers could print headlines. Relief washed through the neighborhood like cool rain after drought. The unpredictable terror that had stalked 125th Street was gone. Bumpy Johnson received confirmation while contemplating a chess position in Marcus Garvey Park, his opponent mid-move, when a messenger whispered into his ear. Bumpy nodded once, a gesture so minimal it could have meant anything, then returned attention to the board and executed a bishop sacrifice that would lead to checkmate in 7 moves. He finished the game before standing, adjusting his tie, and walking home through Harlem streets that felt subtly different. The investigation that followed consumed weeks of police resources and produced nothing connecting Bumpy to the Newark massacre. Detectives suspected organized crime involvement based on execution-style efficiency, but killers had left no evidence beyond spent brass casings and traumatized witnesses providing contradictory descriptions. Bumpy's alibi was ironclad, supported by dozens of park witnesses who remembered him playing chess during the exact time frame when bullets flew in Newark. Dutch's elimination reshaped power structures across multiple territories simultaneously. His Bronx operations were absorbed by Italian families who brought professional management to chaos. Harlem's numbers racket stabilized under Bumpy's protection, free from random violence and racial terrorism. The National Syndicate learned that eliminating unstable elements preserved everyone's interests more effectively than tolerating profitable madness. 3 days after Dutch's death, Federal Agent Morrison appeared at Bumpy's door, requesting conversation about recent events in Newark and their possible connection to Harlem business disputes. He carried a folder containing photographs, timeline charts, and questions about intelligence that seemed too precise to be coincidental. The question hanging between them was simple. How much could he prove, and what would it cost either man to find out? Federal Agent Morrison spent 6 weeks constructing theories that collapsed under the weight of missing evidence and uncooperative witnesses. He mapped timelines, connecting Harlem disputes to Newark violence, interviewed policy operators who suddenly remembered nothing useful, and reviewed telephone records showing no suspicious patterns. The investigation reached a dead end not because agents lacked suspicion, but because suspicion is not evidence, and intelligence is not a bullet. Someone with strategic understanding had ensured the trail dissolved into nothing before reaching Harlem. Internal memos conceded what field reports could not say publicly. Bumpy Johnson had committed the perfect crime by manipulating variables that made someone else pull the trigger. For Bumpy, victory brought no triumph, only calculation that settled into his consciousness like lead weights. He had eliminated the one man he genuinely feared by demonstrating higher order power, engineering someone else's death through redirected existing forces. Fear had changed direction, no longer flowing from Dutch into Harlem, but radiating outward from Bumpy into the underworld. He became precisely what other men whispered about in careful tones, a figure whose silence carried more threat than another gangster's shouted rage. The cost of that redistribution could not be measured in bodies alone. Harlem streets were calmer. Numbers runners worked without waiting for random beatings, and women walked past corners without shrinking at idling cars. Yet Bumpy understood the moral arithmetic beneath improved stability. He had crossed from community protector reacting to threats into calculated architect deciding who lived and died. His justification remained consistent: protect Harlem at all costs, but methods had sharpened into something colder than neighborhood defense. From that experience, Bumpy internalized a rule governing future decisions more rigidly than written law. The most dangerous enemies are not the strongest or richest, but the most unpredictable. Power can be negotiated with, greed bargained around, even hatred follows familiar patterns. But madness wrapped in racial contempt and random brutality destabilizes entire systems. Dutch Schultz embodied that chaos, weaponizing humiliation as casually as extortion. Dutch's legacy became cautionary folklore, whispered through policy parlors and backroom negotiations. His death served notice that racial disrespect in Harlem carried terminal consequences. Money could be contested, territory fought over, but racial terrorism invited responses beyond standard underworld etiquette. The subtext remained clear. Certain kinds of disrespect triggered destruction disproportionate to any perceived advantage. The final truth emerged with mathematical precision. Bumpy Johnson's greatest act of violence required no weapon in his hand. He orchestrated Dutch Schultz's complete destruction without firing a single shot, using information as ammunition and other men's ambitions as delivery system. The bullets in Newark were simply final punctuation on a sentence written in silence. 3 months later, the circle closed where it began. Bumpy sat at his corner table in Connie's Inn, immaculate in charcoal wool, ivory-handled cane resting against his chair. The waitress Dutch, once humiliated, approached carrying whiskey in a clean glass. Her hand had healed, leaving a thin white scar across her palm where glass had cut her. She no longer trembled with fear, but moved with quiet dignity. She placed the drink down carefully and looked him in the eye, not as servant to master, but as survivor acknowledging protector. "Mr. Johnson," she said softly, the title carrying genuine respect, sharpened by memory. Bumpy nodded once, understanding that properly directed fear could sometimes function as armor for the vulnerable, necessary boundary against monsters who recognize no limits until meeting their own ending.